Hi everyone, it's Janice from the Divorcing Religion podcast. Did you know that it costs me money to produce each episode of this podcast? I'd really appreciate your help to keep my show on the air and helping other people. Please join me over on Patreon, where you can also find commercial-free episodes, and the links are in the show notes. Thanks so much. Hi everyone, just a quick content or trigger warning about this episode with Dr. DJ Williams. We are mentioning suicide and homicide, and near the end there is quite a frank discussion around sexuality as well. Okay, thank you, and I hope to see you again next time. Take care. Hi everyone, welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. I met today's guest when he presented at a Center for Positive Sexuality session on the fascinating and disturbing topic of the threat of mass public violence by incels, or involuntarily celibate males. Dr. Williams is a professor at the Department of Sociology, Social Work, and Criminology at Idaho State University. He's also a board member and research affiliate with the Center for Positive Sexuality, Los Angeles, and a co-founding editor of the Journal of Positive Sexuality and the associate editor of Leisure Sciences. Of additional interest to our audience, DJ was also raised as a Mormon. Welcome, DJ. Nice to have you here.
Thank you, Janice. Good to be here.
I was so intrigued when you gave the presentation on incels and the threat of mass violence that I knew I wanted to reach out to you and have you as a guest on the Divorcing Religion podcast. And then, to my surprise, you mentioned that you also had grown up in a Mormon home and even done your 2 years as a missionary. So maybe that's a good place to start. What was it like for you growing up in a Mormon family?
Well, it was very interesting, for sure. I grew up in a very small town in southern Utah. The town is almost entirely Mormon, so that was the norm. But I've always kind of had a bit of a sensation-seeking streak to me. I wanted to be a stuntman when I was little, and I've ridden down basement stairs on my tricycle, on a bicycle, a snow sled, motorcycle. So I was always doing rather adventurous kinds of things. And some of those things didn't sit very well with my parents and my family, nor many of the community members either, for that matter. So it was challenging. I always felt like I was different. Something was just, there was something a bit atypical about me. And it's just, I think I didn't really fit in at a very basic level. However, I didn't have any other experience or any other way of understanding myself. So I always kind of thought there was something wrong with me. So I would try to fit in. I would beat myself up a lot. And it wasn't until later that I kind of realized, well, hey, wait a minute. Some of these things that, I've perceived as being, limitations or flaws or whatever are actually strengths. And I've used that in my academic career. So it took a long time to kind of move out of that way of thinking. But I feel really lucky that I escaped. My life is really good. And I've kind of come full circle in a lot of ways. My family are still very LDS, and I get along better with them now than I probably ever have.
Interesting.
So I think they've finally given up a little bit on changing my wool from black to white as far as being the black sheep and coming in. They've kind of let me be me, and which I appreciate. But it was quite a ride. It was pretty rough for a while.
Right. And so just out of curiosity, how many siblings do you have, and kind of where were you in the birth order?
So I have 3 older sisters and a younger brother. They're all very, very smart. And I was being compared with them a lot growing up. neighbors and friends would be like, oh, your sisters are so smart. Your younger brother's so smart. And I hated that. I wanted to kind of be me. And so I never took a book home from school. I did no homework. I played around a lot, got poor grades. And I think it was just to be myself, to kind of be different and not be compared. And then I didn't really want to go on a Mormon mission, but I thought it was the right thing to do. And so I went. It was very difficult, but at the same time, that's where I learned to really study. I thought, if I'm going to be teaching Mormonism, I'm going to learn it and learn it well. So I got called to London, and served 2 years there. And I was in an area in London that was primarily Ghanaian. So I learned to speak Ghanaian just on my own.
Oh my gosh.
And started memorizing, the Bible and Book of Mormon and all these different things. And I realized I was actually really smart.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember the day actually, and I thought, I'm going to go back home and I'm going to go to college, because I was never going to go to college. I'm going to go to college and I'm going to be a professor someday. I like this learning and I'm pretty good at it. And so went home, enrolled in college, worked my way up, just loved it. And so I really, even though with all of the challenges with the religion and Mormonism, I kind of owe my career to my mission experience in large part. So there's a big silver lining that I appreciate through all of this.
Nice. Yes. And so my understanding is that you were a bit of a rebel in your teenage years, kind of getting in trouble, taunting some of the older students and older kids, and running like heck to get away and hide. And but so that speaks to some of the thrill seeking potentially that you were talking about. And I wonder, so what was your belief like when you were growing up in the family that you grew up in, where it was important to your parents that you be Mormon, think Mormon, behave like a Mormon? Did you believe, or was it not till you kind of went away to do your missions work that you had a strong belief, or how did that all go?
That's a really good question. I think growing up, I really believed that was true. The Mormon way was true. And again, there must be something wrong with me because certain things didn't make sense. I learned very, very young to play the game. So I learned with many of my extracurricular risk-taking adventures to be very discreet. And so my family had a reputation in town of being a very strong, religious, upright, kind of a model family. And we were very much to keep in line with that sort of perception. So on the surface, I looked like I fit in really, really well. But not far below the surface, there was a whole different experience happening. So I believed it was true. There must be something wrong with me. And then it was on my mission, I actually started challenging some of the basic things of the Mormon church. And I figured there must be good reasons, must be good explanations, but I could not think what they could be. And so that troubled me a little bit. When I got to college, I kept thinking about these things. I learned more about science and philosophy and all these fun kinds of disciplines. And then realized when I kind of put it all together that this just didn't work for me. So that's when I left.
Wow. And how did that go over back at home? Have any of your siblings followed suit, or as everyone else in the family, they continue on their Mormon lives?
So that went over like a lead balloon, right? Nobody was happy. And it was really difficult for everyone, I think. I felt like, my family didn't understand who I was at all. They didn't understand the legitimate questions that I had, and sometimes the responses from different people around would be, well, there's a reason for that. Just don't think about it or don't worry about it. Well, that's not going to work for me. I think about things. I want to figure things out. So those kinds of responses didn't fly. Interestingly, my siblings are all very, very active still. But many of my nieces and nephews have kind of challenged, those core beliefs and they're in various stages, I think, of kind of where they are, what they believe, those kinds of things. So I make a really good crazy uncle, having left and kind of, been quite successful, because generally in my small town, if someone leaves the religion, their life kind of goes to hell, to use that terminology, right? And when I left, my life got better and I was more successful, and I didn't play out the way that many people expected. So to kind of be in this place and then to be able to, mentor, I guess, or support, some of the others in my family who are younger, I think is important. And it's a role that I really like.
Right.
And I'll tell my family members, it's like, I don't care what you believe. If you stay in the church, that's fantastic. I will love you. I'll support you. If you don't know, that's fine too. If you go a whole different way, that's perfectly fine as well. So I want to be as non-judgmental and supportive for all of my family as I can.
Is it surprising that your parents have been able to maintain a somewhat close relationship with you, or do you feel like things have to stay surface with your parents and with your siblings who are really devout?
I think my parents, they were really, really good parents in a whole lot of ways. And they were raised in a certain generation with the traditions and so forth too, right? So I think it was probably harder for them, quite honestly, than it was for me, to leave. And I have much more respect for them as the years have gone on, based on that process. But I've learned, a long time ago to not talk about certain topics, to not talk about certain things. And that's okay. And there's a point where, the way that people believe, there's still really good people, the social networks and so forth are there. Obviously in small communities, you need those really strong relations. My parents, have been key figures in the community in that regard, done a lot of good. So it's like, I realized that it's better to focus on the strengths and the commonalities and those kinds of things than just the differences.
Nice. Yes, that's something that's very healthy and fantastic for those of us who are able to do it. It can really play a role in us being able to move on and build and live healthy lives post religious indoctrination. And when we're born into a deeply religious family, we have no choice. It's our parents who are responsible for keeping us alive. When they tell us it is thus and so, and don't question it, well, we don't have the ability to critically examine the truth claims that they're giving us. And also, we are utterly dependent on them. So if they say it is thus and so, yep, that's what I'm going to put it in there as thus and so. And I'm going to erect all kinds of psychological booby traps so I don't pull on any loose threads there and have the whole thing start to fall apart. And so when you were attending then college and university and exposed to philosophy and science and all these things that were so much bigger than what you had been taught, was there fear? Did you experience fear or confusion? Or were you just like, oh, well, this explains an awful lot. And no, that other thing that my parents were teaching me, that's just kind of their coping mechanism? Or
Yeah, I think I was so excited to learn all of these new ways of thinking and to learn actual history and science and all these wonderful things that were outside the parameters, of acceptability when I was younger. And so there's a part of me that was so excited and just eating all of that up. But I think in my relations with people, including often in my family who were still very devout Mormon, the Mormon religion is the truth, right? And so everything else is less than. So even though I'm learning all of these amazing things in my head, it was all sort of measured by the standard of Mormonism when I would chat with people still in the fold, right? And that was really frustrating. So I had my reasons for doubting and for leaving, and I'm learning all these new things, but I really couldn't talk about it other than very briefly and superficially, because the Mormon religion had the right answers. Like, why would I need to go to study psychology if we already know what human behavior is all about through this religious doctrine, right? So there was always that measuring against the theology, and that was obviously problematic for both of us. Mm-hmm. So I learned, I think, to keep my mouth closed a lot. I probably didn't do it as much as I should have. But, and then there was a point I think I realized, maybe with a little bit more experience in education, that, I have been in a grieving process through all of this, but my family's also in a grieving process. I think I had more empathy and compassion for them when I recognized that.
Wow, that's so true. And so I'm a registered professional counselor, and I work mainly with people who are exploring their own religious trauma, how they may still be impacted by their religious training today, even though they're no longer part of the church. And grief work is a huge component of the work that I do with my clients, because when your belief system is enmeshed with your identity, and your ideology, your identity, they're just tied together. And then also your community is part of it. And the belief system has a total impact on your worldview, how you make sense of everything. And then when you get to a point where you don't believe that anymore, it can really plunge a person into existential crisis. It can be very, very significant. And I remember even texting my big brother one time. We were both in our 40s or something like that. And he had left the religion long ago. He was an atheist, and he'd been very supportive of me when I left, and he knew how hard it was. And I texted him and said, "Oh my God, if hell isn't real," and I believe that hell wasn't real, does that mean that heaven is not real too? Mm-hmm. And I just was weeping as I texted him, and in true big brother fashion, he was there for me. He was comforting me as best he could. He directed me to some videos that had been helpful for him as he grappled with this. But there's such a grieving process and letting go of our beliefs, of our community, of the identity that we had. And people who didn't grow up in fundamentalist homes, they don't understand it. How can they understand it? I still had to get up and go to work every morning. My entire life was falling apart, and I still had to go to work and make a living. And then I was walking through divorce and whatever else was going on at the time too. So I'm glad that you used the word grief and grieving process, because that's really what happens for us and our family.
Agreed. And I got very suicidal, for a while. And you're exactly right. I think when you shed this identity, it just no longer fits. And then not knowing, for me, who I was and not having other supports, right? So quite honestly, I spent a lot of time in the gym. Like, I loved the gym. I liked the people there. It's kind of one of my little social spaces. So that really helped. I went to counseling. I had a really, really good counselor who helped a lot. So those were two of the things. And then spending time with my daughter. My daughter was only 2 at the time. And I loved her. She was my world. So kind of being the dad and hanging out with her a lot more and kind of hanging on to those things that were still kind of a part of me, but they needed to be a bigger part now that religious piece was gone.
And so that makes me wonder, then, did you marry within the Mormon tradition? Because I know marriage and procreation is really strongly pushed on the young people in those congregations.
I did. I came back from my Mormon mission. I received some information that at that time, I don't know if this still is the case, but they gave us a little flyer that, God wants you to be married within a year and he'll find a way for that to happen, kind of a thing. And so I didn't ever feel good about that. But I thought, well, it must be right. I must be wrong, kind of thinking again, right? That was kind of how my thinking was for such a long time. It didn't feel right. I met a person, a woman, things kind of, went how they went. And I thought, well, this must be the opportunity, even though I had some red flags and it didn't feel right to me. So we ended up getting married in the Mormon temple in Salt Lake City, no less. And it was kind of a disaster right off the bat. We were we thought differently. I was in school and stuff and learning all these things and was kind of challenging my own thinking and challenging the church doctrine a bit and trying to find my way in that. Again, that didn't fly over either. And so we lasted 2 years. It was 2 years of hell for both of us, quite honestly. Got my daughter out of it. And it's kind of funny now because, my daughter's an adult and we'll kind of joke. And it's like, it's a good thing you got the best of your parents, because if you would have got the worst of us, you'd be a real mess. Right. So we've tried to make the best of it over time.
Is she Mormon?
She is. Yes, she is Mormon, still very, very devout, always has been. But we were not a good match on so many levels.
Right.
And again, it didn't feel good. And over time, I think with more life experience and education and so forth, being exposed to more diversity, I've realized that I get into trouble when I don't trust myself. If I don't trust myself and I kind of get persuaded from something, that's when I've kind of made questionable calls. So,
wow. Yeah. And you mentioned the phrase red flags. There were red flags. You didn't see them. And it is true, because when we are deeply religious, we're wearing rose-colored glasses. And when you're wearing rose-colored glasses, a red flag just looks like any other flag. So we miss out on those very important warnings. And also, we're taught not to trust in our own heart or lean on our own understanding. The heart is deceitfully wicked above all things. These are some of the verses that I remember growing up with. And that is so dangerous to teach children, to teach anybody that they can't trust themselves. We must be able to trust ourselves. And so you went to school, you loved studying, you got your PhD, and somehow you have ended up kind of interested in the spheres of positive sexuality, which I just love, and also the sphere of public violence or preventing violence. And that's how I found you when you were talking about incels. Can you tell me how that all came to be? Because those two things seem kind of quite different.
Sure. I set out to study exercise science. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology and have always been interested in that. So I was going to be a sports psychologist, an exercise psychologist, kind of those areas. And then in graduate school, I got a job offer to work for a company conducting assessments in prison, assessments and treatment. And it was good money, and it worked with my schedule really well. And I had, a friend working there at the time. So I took it on, and I was just fascinated with crime and criminal behavior.
Oh.
And, it's funny because growing up, wanting to be a stunt man and kind of having this sensation seeking personality, my parents at times would say, if you keep hanging out with some of these kids, you're going to end up in prison. And so it was great fun to tell them when I worked in the prison that, yep, you were right, Mom and Dad, I was in prison doing assessments. So we kind of had fun with that. But I was fascinated with crime and all the different dimensions that kind of go into that. And I think that explains some of why it was attractive to me. So I'm taking all of this science, all these different areas, and kind of using it all to try and make sense of criminal behavior. So worked with all different kinds of offenses. And then I got a job offer to work specifically with sex offending, with sex offenders. And so initially I thought, there's no way I can do this. That's just not, it's not what I can do, right? I can't work with that population. And then the job offer was a lot more money. And of course, as a graduate student and needing money, it's like, well, okay, I'll give this a try. And it was interesting because as I started to work with that population and I got into the research and the science, I realized that so much of our policy is based on myth, right? So policy tends to go one direction, the actual science goes another. And I also have to be a little bit careful kind of talking about these things, because sometimes they can be misunderstood as being like pro-sex offender, kind of a thing. And I am certainly not that, right? One experience of sexual violence is way too many. But I really believe that having policy, really no matter what it is, that's based on the best research and science, gives us the best way to prevent problems and to address problems, right? So working with sex offenders, realizing that most of what I knew was myths rather than the science.
Can you give an example of what would be a myth?
Sure. So a common belief is that nearly all sex offenders will reoffend, and that treatment is not effective. And both of those are just not true. Treatment is effective if we do the right treatment that's evidence-based. There's what's called in offender rehabilitation, the risk-need responsivity model. And part of that is matching risk level to treatment intensity. So if we have a really high-risk offender, lots of violence, lots of history of violence and crime, that individual is going to need far more intensive services than somebody who maybe this is their first time in the system for something minor, right? And what the research shows is that with various types of crime, it's that matching that's really important. If you put low-risk offenders in with high-intensity treatment, they'll actually have a worse outcome, right? Okay, so what are we doing with sex offenders? And so there's been some research that has looked at, does this model hold up with sex offenders? And it does. So what that means is we really need to assess carefully and match the appropriate level of intervention, right, based on risk, if we want the best outcome. And in terms of policy, if we say that every sex offender is high risk, then we're not matching in a way that we should be.
Right. And is someone in some states might someone be labeled a sex offender if, maybe they're a 21-year-old and they were having a relationship with an 18-year-old, and then sometimes they might have to go on a registry or something. That's happens. So different from.
It is.
Yeah.
It is, but that's the sex offender laws have become more punitive, right? And that's another issue with policy, because policy is largely built on the most horrific, worst cases, right? And so if our policy and our laws say that we are going to do this, but in reality, that risk level varies a lot, then just by not having that flexibility in law based on the science of risk, we're setting ourselves up for recidivism, right?
Mhm.
And so that's part of the issue. And then you're right. What happens is we're so afraid of sexuality and these crimes and what might happen. And we should be afraid, right? I mean, we should be careful, but not to the point where we start criminalizing all of these kind of minor things under laws that are very punitive and don't fit, right?
Yeah.
So that's one of my big frustrations with all of this, which actually gets into the roots of sexuality much more broadly in terms of how we think about it and what's okay and what's not okay and all these kinds of things that we're taught. I teach a class here on sexual crimes, and I spend the first third of the class probably just talking about basic sexuality and kind of undoing some of those common myths before I can get into the laws and policies and so forth more specifically. Because if we don't have a good understanding of general sexuality, then how can we have good policies, right? So all of this stuff snowballs. And that's a real problem.
Yeah, and it sure makes me, I mean, it sounds like the laws. I'm in Canada, you're in the United States, but there's so much similarity there. The laws almost seem to be punitive, also because in a lot of ways they seem to be based on a biblical model, the idea of an eye for an eye. And then I think of the First Nations people who inhabited both our spaces before we were here, and they did things much differently. They had a much different approach to the community and trying to restore members to the community, or to hand out justice in that way, in a community-minded way. And you're right. People put sex offenses in an entirely different category. Like some people who've done violent crimes are welcomed back into family or community somewhat more easily than someone who has committed sexual crimes. So it is an area that definitely needs to be studied, and we need to make improvements in treatment and in laws.
You're correct, and I'm glad that you bring up sort of the retributive justice based on a biblical model compared to more First Nations restorative approaches. And we find that restorative approaches are more effective. And one of the interesting things, not surprisingly, is that oftentimes victims of sexual crimes can feel re-victimized in the retributive system. And that's really unfortunate. Mm-hmm. Whereas in a restorative model, people sit together, they figure out how healing can occur, what needs to happen. And so I think victims feel much more empowered through that model. So we do see better outcomes with variety of types of crimes from a more First Nations restorative approach. And yet our society does not want to go that way.
No, no, it certainly does not. I'm wondering how you went from studying sex offenses and offenders in the prison system to becoming an expert on incels, on the incelibate, involuntarily celibate community. I'm not even sure if I'm saying that right, but you know exactly who I'm talking about.
I know what you're saying. Yeah, so kind of trying to shorten the story just a little bit. When I went to do my PhD in Canada, by the way, at the University of Alberta.
Lovely.
So I identify partly as Canadian, at least in my own head, right? Love Canada, but I read a study on kink, and I was still kind of working on sex offender issues and so forth. And the study, and this was back in like 2004, 2003, something like that. There wasn't a whole lot of research on kink back then, but the research then showed that people who engage in kink are really pretty psychologically and socially stable and healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of scratched my head and thought, well, that's interesting. I don't know if that's right. Again, I come from a very Mormon, Puritan religious upbringing. And so I dug into that literature and kind of found that that was consistent. And that started my interest in, alternative sexuality, research on kink and non-monogamy and some of these other areas. So that really expanded my areas of interest. And that's been a large part of my career, quite honestly. And then a few years ago, 2015, I think, I got tenure and kind of reevaluated my career a little bit and decided that, this whole leisure angle, what people do that's enjoyable and fun and intrinsically motivated and has these different benefits. I was thinking about that with crime, and especially really violent crime. So primarily serial murder. We know that serial killers enjoy killing people. Everybody knows that.
Mm-hmm.
The FBI has known that forever, right? But here I thought, okay, somebody needs to marry these two areas, homicide research and leisure science, because leisure is the study of enjoyment and fun and pleasure, right? We want to know why some people like skiing and other people enjoy going to museums and all these different things. And so after thinking about it, I thought, well, I'm really the person that's perfectly situated to do this. And so I started looking at the leisure side of serial murder.
Wow.
And published some work on that. Worked on some cases with that, and it ended up being quite fruitful. It explained some things that we didn't know before. And from there, I kind of went into mass murder a little bit, and looking at certain cases of mass murder as kind of the ultimate final leisure project. And then, kind of thinking a little bit more directly with sex negativity versus positivity and leisure and mass murder and violence, the Incel group kind of was on my radar. And I thought, what about, self-identified involuntary celibates who have committed mass murder? Can we learn anything about the psychology of that particular group? And given that Incel communities are rapidly growing online, and given that we have a number of kind of risk factors as far as inflation and the economy, it's tougher to live in a lot of ways and kind of make ends meet. So given those kinds of situational factors, I would expect that there might be quite a few cases like this. And so that kind of prompted the study to look at incels who commit mass murder specifically.
And so when you say inflation and harder to make a living and so forth, I'm wondering how those connect. My immediate thought is if people can't afford to if they can't find a job and they're not out rubbing shoulders with other people every day, and if they don't have the money to do kind of more normal, regular kind of leisure activities, they're home on the computer, totally just zoned in and potentially engaged in unhealthy communities and getting that feedback all the time and kind of sinking deeper and deeper into radicalized thinking.
Yeah. So one of the things that we know with a variety of different cases of mass murder is we really look at that through a cumulative strain lens. So you'll have someone, whether it's, a school shooting or something that's ideologically motivated or a disgruntled employee. So there's different types of this for sure. And there's, of course, private mass shooting events and so forth too, right? But when we look at some of the commonalities we look at the micro level, we look at the individual, and we see, things like maybe this person is a loner, kind of has some schizoid traits, doesn't really fit in, a lot of personal stress, those kinds of things. But then when we see some of these more macro level factors, the economy kind of takes a tank. People don't have a job, they can't get employment. They're ostracized from their communities. So what we see is similar to suicide risk. When we see lots of risk factors, and we see very few protective factors, very few good things, then that risk level goes up, right? And in cases of mass murder, that blame or the responsibility, I guess, is really externalized. So perpetrators will focus on something that they perceive to be the cause, even though there are all of these negative things happening, right? So they kind of become obsessed with the cause, and that tends to factor into target selection, fantasy. So they have thoughts, and then there's a certain point in the process if things still continue to be very difficult, then at some point there's a commitment to executing, a mass murder. And a lot of times people think that, somebody snaps. So this is kind of a sudden, spontaneous, kind of a thing. A lot of homicides are impulsive, right? They're emotional. People don't self-regulate. But mass murders are different. They're calculated. They're planned for weeks, if not months, sometimes years. So there's a trajectory that people go through. So with incels, it's like the question became, okay, we see a rise in this community. We see a rise in some ways in risk factors, right? That doesn't always translate into actual cases. Cases tend to kind of ebb and flow a bit. A lot of times people think mass public shootings are increasing substantially. Fortunately, they're not, or at least they haven't been. They'll go up a little bit, they go down. They kind of go up a little bit and down and so forth. So there's kind of that sort of pattern over the decades. But when we see risk factors increase, when we see an upward trajectory, we all get nervous, and we should, right? And so given all of those sort of situational factors, I thought, well, let's look at incels specifically and see if there's some things we can learn in terms of numbers of cases, in terms of the psychology, maybe some of the demographic features of attacks that have been motivated by incel ideology specifically. So that was sort of the thinking that went into that study. And I wasn't sure we could actually do it. Sometimes you can design a study, you can have a great question, and you just don't have the data, you don't have the way to make it happen. But in this case, we did our best, and I think we succeeded in large part. Oh. And as you know from the podcast where we chatted, the good news is there are far fewer of these cases than we thought there might be. And the bad news is that risk factors are still really high. And so we have to monitor this, I think, pretty carefully and try to mitigate that.
Right. Okay. And so when people are thinking of some of the horrible atrocities that we know from the news have been committed by incels. So I know there was a man in Canada, and he rented a van, and he unfortunately drove and, killed a number of people. I think in the United States, there was someone with a gun in a restaurant situation who did something similar. I'm wondering about what similarities are there? Is there any one thread other than these males have felt rejected sexually by females? Are they ever putting focusing on themselves and thinking, well, the problem is with me, or is it always focused outward? The problem is just those women.
I think in general with public mass attacks, the problem is externalized. So it's always something in the environment. It could be because some of the incel attacks, as you know, are quite broad, right? Like the one in Toronto that you referred to. So some of the thinking tends to be, okay, we live in a society that allows this, therefore I'm going to make society pay, right?
Mm.
So there's more of a generalized target, whereas in other cases it's more specific. So I can't get a date with really attractive women, or I think they're really attractive or whatever, they won't pay any attention to me. So the target tends to be more specific in a place where attractive women might be. So you can have the same type of motivation, you can have the same risk factors, but the specificity of target selection varies quite a bit.
Okay. And what about things like what about things like ethnicity? Is a person any more likely to be a Caucasian as opposed to a non-Caucasian person committing these crimes?
With incels specifically, we only had 7 people in our sample, which is good news, right?
Yes.
So I don't think we can really generalize in that way.
Right.
However, you are right in that in a lot of attacks, not just incels, but other types of mass attacks, public mass violence attacks, there seems to be sort of this damaged masculinity perception, right? And so, and so it's sort of like the person overcompensates by, getting lots of weapons and exerting power in a very, very overt way, right? So there is that piece in terms of how attacks can be expressed. We see that a lot, and that can be a number of different sort of racial or ethnic makeups, right? But I think the psychology and the risk factors are really consistent. When a person doesn't feel integrated in society, right? When they really struggle with paying the bills and making ends meet, can't get a job, don't have friends, some of those basic things, then we start to see problems, however those problems may play out.
Mhm.
And so a lot of times we focus on individual characteristics when we really probably ought to be thinking social characteristics and economic types of characteristics.
Mhm. Mhm.
When the economy does well, when people have stable employment, when they're satisfied that way, it reduces personal stress. And so we see fewer social problems, of course, of all varieties when those macro level factors are met.
Right. And because this is the Divorcing Religion podcast, I have to ask about religion and purity culture indoctrination. I feel like that must, on some level, play a part.
I believe that it does. Uh, for a few different reasons, probably. One is that people's sexual identities are far more complex than we often like to think. And so to be in a system where there are very few options in terms of expressing one's identity, expressing one's sexuality, that by itself makes important needs they lack being met, right? So I think we need to have a much broader space for people to be who they are, right? And that space needs to happen, I think, in religious or spiritual settings. I think it needs to happen in other social settings. And legally, I mentioned we kind of have this punitive, we like our moral panics in this country, which sometimes spill over into Canada at times, right? But I think with laws and policy, we also need to not panic about these things and kind of have more open space for diversity too. And then, with Puritan culture, we're talking sexual diversity, but of course that can be all kinds of different demographic dimensions as well.
Right. I mean, I wonder about the role of patriarchy when it comes to incel violence, because it seems to be men who believe they have a right to
Yes.
women's bodies, or they are thinking that women should obey them. And this is, of course, tied in with religion, fundamentalist religion as well.
Sure, you're absolutely right. And I would say much of incel ideology is like patriarchy on steroids, right? I mean, it's very, very patriarchal, misogynistic, all of those kinds of things. And to kind of recognize again, thankfully, there are very, very few cases of extreme violence by incels, and most incels denounce violence, but that rhetoric is still there and very prevalent. The hate speech, the ideology is still there. So that's still problematic for sure.
Yes, and the fact of not having friends, not and I hear this from fairly routinely from young people and even older adults now, and I think especially since the pandemic, but it can be hard to make friends in adulthood, and people are desperately lonely. And so if someone has grown up and they've always had a hard time making friends, they've kind of been the odd one out. So they already are feeling, they're aware that society is not accepting them. And then to spend more and more time indoors, like I said, plugged into various communities, some of which are not terribly healthy. And so we're talking about incels, but this also can be, people can get sucked down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole, and they're, for the first time in their life, finding acceptance, finding community. And this happens, this gets people drawn into cults, high demand religious groups. It's all of a piece.
You're absolutely right. And we know that, some of these fringe groups, the manosphere, the white supremacy, the incels, a number of these different groups, conspiracists, people find those sites by accident. And you're right. Generally, we see social anxiety. We see people who feel powerless. Mm-hmm. And you're right. They come onto these sites by accident. All of a sudden, there's a community. They have some social connection there and some social support. And incels specifically say that the communities actually are very supportive and beneficial that way, which is significant. But at the same time, it's easy for people to get drawn down the rabbit hole and end up somewhere else.
Right. And especially if the attention is devoted to the men who've already committed the very violent acts, if they're lauded, and if there's then egging on and encouragement within that online community to do something even worse, prove right. your faithfulness to the cause, right. This sort of thing. And I wonder, does it tend to be men who are younger than 30?
It does. Yeah, so incels can be sort of categorized. We have virginal incels. They tend to be younger, under 30, usually like early 20s, early to mid 20s. And then there's single incels. So they've had, a sexual experience, but they're not in a relationship and are wanting a relationship, but can't seem to find one, obtain one. And then there's partnered incels who have a partner, but for various reasons may not be able to have, the sexual relationships that they want. So in acts of mass violence, we see overwhelmingly that it's the virginal incels. It's the younger, wanting sexual experience, not being able to have those. Again, there's a significant piece with, wanting to exert their masculinity in a traditional way. That's problematic. So we see all of those kinds of negative forces kind of come together at that point.
You have really chosen a focus in your work that is challenging. I think most of us, it's like being a homicide detective in some ways. You are really seeing horrible things, and not just seeing them, but diving in and exploring them. So thank you for talking with us about it. And just so that we don't quite end on such a heavy note, would you please tell us a little bit about your work regarding positive sexuality? I have you here as a co-founding editor of the Journal of Positive Sexuality, and I first encountered you at a session put on by the Center for Positive Sexuality.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I spent time in both spaces, the positive sexuality world, people have fun, they enjoy it. It's, there's all this diversity. And then I spent time over on the dark side, right? And I was actually giving a talk in London last year to a group of world leaders on threat assessment and protection. And I have to say, it's much more fun being in London, not as a Mormon missionary compared to being a missionary, right?
Yeah.
Very different experience this time. But in my talk, I was talking about incels and, the mass murder study. And I mentioned that it was very personally taxing to go through all of these records and social media sites that are filled with just vitriol and the worst things that could ever be written is really difficult. And so I was telling the audience that it was really necessary to kind of work on that for a bit, but then come over on the positive sexuality side. And at the time, we were doing a study on pegging, right? So, heterosexual couples where the male receives, anal penetration from the female partner.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of funny because one of my colleagues who kind of initiated the study, she's like, there's no research on this. And I'm like, well, of course there's not, right? Like, what academic is going to do a study on this? But we found just how much fun these couples had and just how good it was for their relationship, and it built trust and it improved their communication, all of these wonderful things. And so to kind of go from one extreme over to the other extreme was really interesting, but it was really psychologically helpful for me, I think, to kind of break that up. And so I'd mentioned this in my talk, and there was a woman from Sweden who came up after me. She said, the bit you talked about positive sexuality, like, that's the most important part of all of this, is we need to kind of focus on that and make sure that we're all okay and that we're happy and all of these kinds of things. So I bounce around a bit, partly on interests and partly on taking care of myself. And it's all interesting. I didn't set out as a young Mormon boy to get into any of this, but life has a way of going how it goes, and I feel pretty fortunate.
Oh yeah. Well, I think kinks and fetishes and all different aspects of sexuality, and we're thinking of healthy sexuality, positive sexuality. I work with people who are recovering from toxic purity culture indoctrination. Last year, I hosted the Shameless Sexuality Life After Purity Culture online conference. It's so important for people to get to a point where they are comfortable with their own sexuality and where they can be comfortable with other people's sexuality. And for some of my clients who grew up in purity culture, they have found within the BDSM community, that's been the first place they've really learned about consent and the power of consent. And it's been an important part of the healing journey for some of my clients. So I just find that really interesting. I'm so grateful that you spent time with me today. Thank you very much. I hope I can invite you back in the future.
Thank you, Janice. So good to see you again, and keep up the great work that you're doing.
And,
appreciate you as well.
Oh, thank you. I think hopefully you've sent me some links. I think you have, where if people want to find out more about the Center for Positive Sexuality, is there a place people could read anything that you've done, or is it all strictly in journals, psychological journals and so forth?
If people have some specific areas, they're welcome to email me, djwilliams@isu.edu. So I can send some specific kinds of things The center is fantastic. So positivesexuality.org is their website. And then our journal, the journal of positivesexuality.org, has all kinds of great research in it, information. Most of the articles are shorter, user-friendly, and it doesn't cost anything. It's online. So lots of good resources out there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, it's just been a real pleasure talking with you. And I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. And you can reach me at divorcing-religion.com. And I hope we'll see you all again soon. Take care, DJ. Bye, everyone.